Welcome to Badass Stories from Byzantium, a podcast where I tell the woe and WTF parts of the Byzantine Empire's history, an overlooked and often underexplored subject in Western popular culture. I am your host, Keith Hernandez, and I hope to gently guide you out of the warm embrace of filicidal mothers and into the boiling hot cauldron of medieval napalm. Come with me to the end of the line for the Romií and beyond. Smoke, debris, and bodies lay before Mehmed II's Janissaries as they poured into the great land wall of Constantinople. The defending Byzantine and Latin soldiers, exhausted from the fighting that had exploded at midnight, now ran toward the rising sun. The city proper was a long way off, and so too were their means of escape. The Ottomans pursued their adversaries, cutting down some 2,000 men before stopping to plunder the nearby houses and religious buildings along the wall. Each soldier rushed to lay his claim, planting a flag here and there to signify to his brethren, "These are mine." As most of the city's inhabitants were starting to stir, one could be forgiven for thinking it was another normal day under siege. News had not yet reached the city proper that Mehmed's troops had overwhelmed the defenses. Morning services were just starting. One such service at St. Theodosia was interrupted when the Janissaries resumed their advance and barged inside, killing and looting indiscriminately. When the people finally realized what was happening, pandemonium engulfed Constantinople. As before, with the Latins in 1261, and the Byzantines themselves in 1204, a population of 60,000 people tried to hide in any crevice in which they could fit, or in the holy places, where they believed God would save them. Several took refuge in the Hagia Sophia, where it was believed an angel would destroy New Rome's enemies should the city fall. Others tried to escape, though their options, as one can imagine, were quite limited. The land route was blocked off by the Ottoman army, and the Venetian ships in the harbor could only take so many refugees. Even worse for the panic-stricken people, these Latin ships were mostly taking Italian and wealthy Byzantine passengers. Despite this, thousands of Constantinopolitans lined the harbor and took their own chances, rowing tiny boats out to the Latin fleet or swimming. Many drowned. To the Venetians' credit, the ship stayed until midday to pick up as many people as they could, 6,000 in all. A wounded and dying Giovanni Giustiniani was among those for whom they waited. When the ships finally left the harbor, the Ottoman fleet paid them no mind. They were focused on getting into the city, so they too could join in the plunder. For those left behind, the horrors that came with the sacking were in order. In accordance with Mehmed's custom, this would last for 3 days. The Ottoman army plundered, burned, murdered, and raped. When all was said and done, some 4,000 combatants and non-combatants were killed, Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos among them, and the tens of thousands who remained were enslaved. Half were taken to the slave market in Adrianople, and the others were sent across the Ottoman Empire and gifted by Mehmed to other Muslim rulers. The destruction was so great that even the Sultan was said to be moved when he rode in on the afternoon of the first day. "What a city we have given over to plundering and destruction," he supposedly uttered with a tear in his eye. The Venetian fleet first stopped at the Byzantine islands of Limnos and Imbros and the Aegean Sea, where they took on more passengers from the now frightened populace. From there, they stopped at Chios, and then made their way to the Venetian island of Crete on June 29th. On that same day, a much faster ship carrying the news of Constantinople's fall reached Venice, where word started to spread of the disaster. Outside of the Doge's palace were sad and angry people demanding an explanation for the lack of intervention. From there, the news traveled throughout Italy and reached as far as England, where solemn processions were held for a dying empire that had finally met its end. This story comes from a slew of different voices compiled in historian Jonathan Harris's The End of Byzantium, which is also the main source for today's episode. I wanted to start off with this story because it illustrates the two paths that lay before the Roman people after the fall of Constantinople: a life of exile in Western Europe, or a life of oppression under the Ottoman Empire. Both paths would lead to the creation of new identities under familiar names. A renewed interest in Hellenism would travel with Byzantine refugees who pined for an even more ancient past than Rome as they witnessed the end of Constantine's empire. So too would their Latin cousins look to the past to discover more about themselves, ushering in the Italian Renaissance and, by effect, the modern world. For those without connections to the West, enslavement and second-class citizenship awaited them under the Porte. The polity that was East Rome effectively ended after 1453, and after living memory of the empire passed on, so too did the Romií as subjects of said polity. But their sense of solidarity did not wane under Ottoman oppression. In fact, it grew stronger. This is the third and final part in a three-part series dealing with Byzantine identity in the context of the empire's decline. If you have not heard the other two, Episode 4, Phoenix in the East, and Episode 5, Ashes to Ashes, I encourage you to do so wherever you're listening to this podcast. In today's episode, I will start off by examining the last of the Palaiologi, who were still in possession of Byzantine territory to the south after the fall of Constantinople. Next, I will take a deeper dive into the two paths Eastern Romans were forced to take after the Byzantine Empire's decline. In doing so, we will see where these people went and what traces of the Roman identity survive today. Just a quick caveat, I know there are Romans from the city of Rome who have identified as such all throughout its existence. But since this is a podcast dealing with the Eastern Roman Empire, which outlived its Western counterpart as a polity by 1,000 years, I will be keeping my parameters in the East. Sorry, Rome. It's nothing personal. Let's recap the last episode so we can get our bearings. In Episode 5, Ashes to Ashes, I examined the Byzantine Empire's death spiral from 1261 to 1453, a stretch of time characterized by civil war, plague, invasion, territorial decline, and a policy of Western intervention in the face of Ottoman aggression. As we learn, the West was not too keen on the idea of saving its eastern cousin, though some attempts to do so were made. In the end, Constantinople was alone and surrounded by the Ottoman army. It breathed a death rattle on May 29, 1453, when Mehmed II's men poured into its great land walls and killed Emperor Constantine XI. Yet, there were still free Palaiologi who drew breath. It's 1453. The great Roman Phoenix is smoldering, its capital in ruins, and emperor dead. But the Palaiologan line was not. It continued in the despots Demetrius and Thomas Palaiologos, rulers of the semi-autonomous Byzantine Morea, a large chunk of land in the Peloponnese. These brothers were prevented from intervening in Constantinople's fall by an Ottoman invasion in 1452, but to their surprise, Mehmed did not plan to stay in the south. To the contrary, he called off the invasion and instructed the despots to pay an annual tribute of 10,000 ducats, which they graciously agreed to pay. On the face, there was peace, but behind the scenes, Thomas, who had adopted the policy of Western intervention, was working diligently to start a crusade. His pitch may have lacked the prestige and possibility of material reward that characterized previous aid requests from Byzantium, but what it did not lack was a worthy cause. The stories from those left behind and those who had escaped Constantinople were enough to spur sympathy in the hardest of hearts. The horrors of enslavement and discomfort of exile quickly reached the Morea in 1453. The despot Thomas personally ransomed the release of many Byzantines, including 52-year-old George Safrances, who had been captured and enslaved after the fall of Constantinople. If you remember from the last episode, Safrances was an advisor to the emperor and helped tally the city's defenses. His story is a sad one, but also one that typifies the experience of well-connected Constantinopolitans whose family were bought and sold like cattle. The trauma Safrances experienced was enough for him to wish he hadn't been born, or to have died young, if only to save himself from the horrors of the 15th century. He lost a sister, along with her entire family, to bubonic plague in 1416 and experienced a series of tragedies that preceded Mehmed II's encroachment on the capital. In Safrances, The Fall of the Byzantine Empire, he chronicles his and his family's enslavement. He writes, "I was taken prisoner and suffered the evils of wretched slavery. Finally, I was ransomed on September 1st, 1453, and departed from Mistra. My wife and children passed into the possession of some elderly Turks, who did not treat them badly. Then, they were sold to the Sultan's master of the horse, who amassed a great fortune by selling many other beautiful noble ladies. My children's beauty and proper bringing could not be concealed. Thus, the Sultan found out and bought my children from his master of horse for many thousand aspers. Thus, the wretched mother was left alone in the company of a single nurse. The rest of her attendants had been dispersed." The closing of 1453 would see the death of Safrances' 14-year-old son by the Sultan, who claimed the boy had conspired to murder him. The following year, Safrances would secure the release of his wife, but could not do the same for his 14-year-old daughter, who died from an infection in Mehmed's harem. Those lucky few who had escaped Constantinople in 1453 dispersed throughout Italy and the rest of Europe, gravitating towards wealthy patrons who could give them a pension off of which to live. Those who did not have the luxury of deep connections traveled as far as Scotland and Spain, touring the continent much like Manuel II, but this time begging for ransom money to free their families. These refugees were helped by many sympathetic people, and by religious authorities who gifted them indulgence letters, which promised spiritual rewards to Western leaders for their help. Others sold family heirlooms and relics. And if all this wasn't enough to spark the sympathy of the West, surely the destruction of Constantinople itself would. The city had been thoroughly emptied of both people and possessions. What remained were ruins, some standing religious buildings now occupied by a few Ottomans, and a ghostly silence. Not even Mehmed stayed behind. He traveled to Adrianople not even a month after his conquest to await the rebuilding of the city. The Pope, for his part, did not need much convincing that something needed to be done. He called for a crusade in September 1453 to recover Constantinople from Mehmed II. Many Western leaders enthusiastically answered the call in the next couple years with promises to contribute tens of thousands of men and ships. For their part, the desire to intervene too seemed sincere. In a letter to the Doge of Venice around this time, a Catholic cardinal puts this sincerity on display. He writes, "Wretched me, I cannot write this without the most profound sorrow. A city which was so flourishing, with such a great empire, so many illustrious men, such very famous and ancient families, so prosperous, the head of all Greece, the splendor and glory of the East, the school of the best arts, the refuge of all good things, has been captured, despoiled, ravaged, and completely sacked by the most inhumane barbarians, and the most savage enemies of the Christian faith, by the fiercest of wild beasts." An Ottoman defeat to the Hungarians of 1456 added to the growing momentum of intervention. Even the despot Demetrius, a staunch anti-unionist, began to support the idea. The despots were so convinced by this point that Western aid was inevitable that they stopped paying tribute to the Ottomans. I'm sure you can imagine, based on what we've previously heard, what was going to happen. The crusade, despite all of its sincerity and momentum, would never materialize. Not one Catholic monarch would set out with an army. After 3 years of not receiving tribute and catching wind of this supposed crusade, Mehmed invaded the Morea. He traveled through the despot's land, virtually unopposed, burning, pillaging, and capturing towns along the way, and took about a third of the Byzantine territory there. Following that debacle, the brothers turned on each other, Thomas receiving Western and Albanian help, and Demetrius receiving Ottoman help. Mehmed would wind up quelling the civil war in person in 1460, forcing Demetrius to resign and Thomas to flee to Venetian Corfu. From there, he went to Rome, where the Pope provided he and his family a monthly pension of 300 ducats. With the loss of the Morea went the possibility for a Byzantine government in exile, as we had seen in Nicaea in the 13th century. The Roman refugees now had no place to call home. This podcast is brought to you by Spanish Consulsa. I want to tell you about a podcast I recently discovered that I know you're going to love. If you want to learn Spanish and connect with the 572 million people who speak Spanish around the world, you should definitely check out the Learn Spanish Consulsa podcast. Every week, host Tamara Marie brings you one step closer to fluency by making language learning fun and effortless. Learn Spanish Consulsa immerses you in Latino culture and teaches Spanish through music and conversation. Delete all those boring, robotic language learning apps and listen to authentic Spanish you can use in conversations with real people. Subscribe to the Learn Spanish Consulsa podcast now and hear a new episode every Tuesday. Just search for Learn Spanish Consulsa wherever you're listening to this podcast. We come down to the first of two paths that were forced upon Eastern Romans after the fall of Constantinople and the Morea: exile at the mercy of its Western hosts. These people, mostly wealthy aristocrats and thinkers, would make up the first of two waves of Greek-speaking migrants in this time. Though their ideas would grow in the places they inhabited, their communities would not, as this first wave was quickly absorbed by the Western European courts that hosted them. Many, like the despot Thomas Palaiologos, fled to the Venetian territory such as Corfu. From there, they fled further into Italy, hoping their stay would be short due to the renewed drumbeat of crusade after the fall of the Morea. Pope Pius II planned for an 88,000-strong army to retake Constantinople with the help of a fleet from Venice, who had recently declared war on the Ottoman Empire in 1463. The crusade was officially called that year, and the fleet was starting to gather in Ancona, an Italian port city on the coast of the Adriatic Sea, much to the excitement of the former despot Thomas, who had been touring Italy to grow support for the crusade. The beginning of this crusade stands out as an exception, as an army had indeed gathered and was ready to set sail. But tragically, for the displaced Romans, the Pope died on August 15, 1464, shortly after arriving in Ancona, to sail with the fleet, effectively killing the crusade. With no hope whatsoever of returning home, the exiles sought the patronage of their Western European hosts and more influential exiles, such as Thomas, in order to survive. But these lifelines could only sustain them for as long as those providing them lived. Not even the great imperial line was unaffected by this. After Thomas died, the remaining Palaiologan heirs were placed under a papal pension that eventually dwindled until they themselves were impoverished. I'll touch more on this in a bit. The more educated refugees were able to get by writing and teaching Greek literature, which was becoming the fad in 15th century Europe. In fact, Byzantine thinkers had already been planting the seeds of Hellenism at home and abroad for some time. One such thinker, popularly known as Platon, was a renowned philosopher and imperial advisor in the late Byzantine Empire, who is perhaps most well known for helping rekindle the study of Plato in Italy. This rekindling became revolutionary, as Plato's epistemology and political philosophy contributed in no small part to a new, human-centric way of thinking that challenged the dogmas of the Christian East and West. What came to be known as humanism upheld that truth and goodness lies within human beings, and moral perfection can be sought from within. This ran at odds with the prevailing Judeo-Christian way of thinking that held that human beings are too flawed to rule themselves, and that truth and goodness can only be found in the divine. Though these ideas often butted heads with Eastern Orthodoxy, they had been growing in popularity towards the end of the Byzantine Empire. See, Hellenism had never really disappeared after antiquity. Those who were fortunate enough to receive an education were educated in the Greek classics, so it was very much still a part of the Byzantine intellectual life. Anthony Caldelas alludes to this when he writes in Hellenism in Byzantium, quote, "The West rediscovered the classics and proudly boasts of it. Byzantium could never forget them." But the times were changing, and the Orthodox Christian foundation was starting to falter. Hellenism provided alternative ways of thinking. For Manuel Chrysolorus, one of the first Byzantine figures to teach Greek in the West since the early Middle Ages, it provided a way to appeal to the Pope when Western intervention was desperately needed to break the siege of Constantinople in the 1390s. He stressed the similarities between Rome and Constantine's city, citing the many Hellenes who wrote about the beauty of Rome, and the many Romans who appreciated Greek culture and art, and was particularly fond of the Roman representations of ancient Greek heroes. So how does this all relate to refugees who fled Byzantium after its fall? Well, for some, Hellenism didn't just provide alternative ways of thinking, but also provided alternative ways of being. The recent Roman past had failed them, so they looked back even further to the Greek-speaking ancient ancestors who had reached unmatched cultural heights in their eyes. In doing so, they disregarded their painful Roman identity and in its place, installed a more hopeful Hellenic one, predating Hellenic nationalism in Greece by several hundred years. The poetry of Michael Maroulis Tarkaniota represents this shift in being. Maroulis was a Byzantine mercenary and poet who was born in exile in Italy. He had never been to Constantinople before it fell, and therefore looked to paganism to express his sense of loss for a homeland he never knew. He found in this new identity a link to the past, where his Greek ancestors roamed freely in a land that was currently under Ottoman occupation. The gods, however, were indifferent to the suffering of man, and Maroulis knew this. Why else would they have let Constantinople fall? There's a passage from one of his poems I'm going to share, because in hearing it, you'll get a sense of the loss that even someone born in exile felt. He writes, "In my misery I look upon you, my native land, a pitiful corpse, still scarcely believing when I see with my own eyes such a wicked act of the gods. O wretched and unhappy race, to what depths has your former good fortune fallen?" For the even less fortunate refugees, identity meant little in the face of survival. Many fell into a life of begging. Some chose Ottoman subjugation rather than suffer such indignity. One of Thomas's sons, Manuel Palaiologos, would do so after his father's death. Manuel went back to Constantinople, where he was warmly welcomed by Mehmed II. His brother Andreas would remain behind, however. In the late 15th century, Andreas began styling himself as Emperor of Constantinople. Under this meaningless title, he toured Europe begging for money, as his papal pension was running dry. He made ends meet by selling other titles, and by, quote, borrowing jewelry from his sister Zoe, who had married the Grand Duke Ivan III in Moscow, which he then sold. He would eventually sell his self-proclaimed title, Emperor of Constantinople, to the King of France for 4,300 ducats. Sadly, none of this amounted to much, as he would die in poverty in Rome in 1502. As I previously said, this first wave of refugees was quickly absorbed by the European communities they latched onto, though the impression they left echoed into the Renaissance. By the 16th century, another wave of Greek-speaking migrants would arrive in Europe. This time, they made up different parts of society, from traders to artisans to sailors. They came in larger numbers and were for the most part allowed to form their own communities, which they did. According to historian Niccolò Fattori, these migrant communities even kept in contact with one another, giving those within a sense of solidarity in a foreign land. And from courts to cities, Greek migration, community formation, and networks of mutual assistance in 16th century Italy, Fattori writes, quote, "In turn, together with bonds of friendship, acquaintance, and professional proximity, these connections would constitute the very basis for the establishment of successful and complex communities of immigrants, able to assist their members, absorb the newcomers, and ease their often traumatic shoehorning in a host society." So the Byzantine polity was gone. The rich and others fortunate enough had fled, some forging new identities and some reinforcing old ones. What about everyone else? Aside from the enslavement of the inhabitants of Constantinople and other Byzantine cities, all water under the bridge. Mehmed II tried to make the transition to his regime as smooth as possible, first by continuing the role of Orthodox Christianity in the East. He established an anti-unionist patriarch in 1454, effectively destroying the Union of Florence for Orthodox Christians under Ottoman rule. Further, although the larger churches were converted into mosques, the smaller ones were left alone. The ethnic makeup of the Balkans would roughly remain the same as well, as Mehmed did not want to replace his newly conquered subjects with Turks. Not right away, at least. That said, he needed to repopulate Constantinople quickly, as he had plans to return it to its former glory, complete with a new palace and mosque. To do so, he had Christians from the Morea relocated to the capital after his campaigns there in 1458 and 1460. Even more, awaiting those abroad was an offer of clemency at home, despite the fact that Mehmed had executed the Byzantine Grand Duke Lucas Notaras and his sons after taking Constantinople. Notaras too was granted clemency once. Mehmed tempted great Byzantine families in exile with promises of security and provisions should they choose to return. Their names included Safrances and Lascaris, among others. By the 1470s, the Sultan's efforts paid off as they started to trickle in, many rising to important positions within the empire. Others worked as tax farmers and merchants, among other professions. As for the aristocracy in the Morea, those who surrendered quickly were able to retain their statuses. Others had to convert to Islam to do so, or to rise even higher. That last bit shows a way in which the Roman people's transition under the Ottoman regime was not so smooth. You see, non-Muslims were second-class citizens whose rights could be taken away at any time. Mehmed, as benevolent as he was, had limits to his kindness. He was accommodating when it suited him, but his mood could shift if he suspected treachery. Those who rose to positions close to him were not safe, and some were stripped of their titles and executed. His habit of enslaving and plundering whole cities was also an unpopular one. He would do so even when promising he wouldn't. Further, those he enslaved were commonly forced to convert to Islam. This would continue through what was known as the Levy of the Boys, a 15th and 16th century practice in which children from Anatolia and the Balkans were gathered to serve the Sultan and his army. Despite the contradictions inherent in calling the Ottoman occupation a smooth transition, Christian Orthodoxy, one of the chief identifiers of Eastern Roman ethnicity, lived on. The Greek language too survived unscathed for the most part, save for some Latin and Arabic additions. There was change, however. These Romií were not the same people as we remember from the 15th century. The empire was gone, and so too was any notion it would come back, so they adapted as their ancestors had done for thousands of years. After living memory of Byzantium had passed, so too did Roman ethnicity as we have learned it. A Romiós was no longer the subject of the Roman Empire, but a Greek-speaking Orthodox Christian and second-class subject under the rule of the Porte. The 400-year Ottoman oppression the Romií faced brought an already nationalistic culture even closer together. Throughout this time, they never stopped seeing themselves as a distinct group, but a new identity would eventually be reshaped out of the old. In the 19th century, the modern Greek state was formed after these Greek-speaking Orthodox Christians revolted against the Ottomans. They called their new state Helida, known to the West as Greece, and they called themselves Hellenes, a formal identity that boasted a cultural continuity from classical antiquity. But it was not yet time for the term Romiós to leave the lexicon. On the contrary, it was solidified concurrently with Hellenos, the latter representing a high-minded ancient past, and the former a folk culture that survived through centuries of oppression. Modern Greek historian Artemis Leontis summarizes this idea in Topographies of Hellenism, mapping the homeland. She writes, quote, "Instead, they made the two, Romiós and Hellenas, equivalent titles of honor, and they kept both in circulation. Their reasoning was that both names had eminent origins. They each bore witness to the twin glory of being Greek." By the way, Dr. Leontis was personally instrumental in helping me understand the meaning and the use of Romiós in the modern day, and I am very grateful for her help. So now we arrive at today. What does Romiós mean, and who uses it? First off, it is still understood to be a term of self-identification and a word that conjures feelings of pride and solidarity over a shared sense of survival through Ottoman oppression. But who uses it? Well, not a lot of people anymore. The word and its history are still well known, but some decades ago it disappeared from everyday speech and became something more used in academic circles. According to Dr. Leontis, a situation in which one may have used the term Romiós was if a Greek speaker unexpectedly heard another person speak Greek. "Excuse me, but are you Romiós?" they may have asked. Yet, though it is not still in popular use, the spirit of Romiós, that the Greek peoples have a long and complex shared history, survives today, albeit far removed from the way the term was originally used. Those Romans died long ago. Thanks for listening, everyone, to part 3 of this 3-part series. I plan to get to the next one on April 10th, and I'm thinking bubonic. And if you haven't already, let me know how you're enjoying the show. Leave a rating or a review, or become a patron for as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/badassbyzantium. Follow me on Twitter and Facebook under Badass Byzantium. Thanks again, and remember, truth is the soul of history.